Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with miniature masterpieces, the Good Friday edition. This is for people who either aren't religious, who may be religious but have very short attention spans. And that's sort of a lot of people, I think. And lest you think I'm being sacrilegious, I need to tell you a story about the source of this particular talk. Now, not being Christian, I don't particularly care about Good Friday or Easter or any of those holidays. It's not my cup of tea. However, we do have Passover, which happens around the same time of the year. And as you know, or may not know, Passover is a home holiday. You have the service around the Passover table, the Seder, as it's called, which the Last Supper was, for example. And that service is guided by a book of prayer called the Haggadah, in which we relate the story of the redemption of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. This can be a very long event. And if you happen to be religious, this year particularly, it was a long event. The reason was because Passover began right after Shabbos, right after the Sabbath, which means that because Jewish holidays go from sundown to sundown, and because during the Sabbath you can't actually do anything, you can't work, you can't cook, you can't make a fire, you can't drive, you can't do anything if you're religious, if you're really Orthodox. You can't even start getting ready for the Seder until Shabbos has ended, which means in this latitude, when the sun goes down plus about 72 minutes. So you're talking like 8 o'clock, 8:30. And at that point, you get to start the Passover Seder. And depending on how long the service is around the table, and it can go for several hours if you do the whole thing, the whole book, well, that means you're not going to eat till like around midnight, which is really rough. I mean, that's just difficult. And one year, my mother, who was a fabulous Passover Seder person, I mean, this was her pièce de résistance holiday. It was an even bigger deal than Thanksgiving. And she really laid it on. We had beautiful, beautiful Passover meals. And they were usually presided on by the elder of the family, who in this case was her father, my grandfather. They would drive up from Delaware, and all of the other uncles and cousins would get together. We'd have a big shindig, and he would lead the service. Now, my grandfather was a butcher, and he was somewhat set in his ways, and a very unaffected personality, shall we say. He didn't stand on ceremony terribly well. And one year, he was I think they were late, there was traffic, something happened. I'm not sure what the deal was, but for whatever reason, he was hungry, they were impatient. We sat down at the table, he looked at us, he picked up the book, getting ready to do the whole thing with the service and whatnot. And he said to us, "Okay, does everybody know the story?" And we all said, "Yes." He said, "Good, let's eat." He put down the book, and that was the service. And this is my Good Friday talk, which I believe is equally pithy. The idea is to let you have your Good Friday celebration without too much ado and without straining your need to focus on these things. And so, for that reason, I have chosen 90 seconds of Good Friday music, and that is The Earthquake from Haydn's The Seven Last Words of the Savior on the Cross. Now, we got to talk a little bit about the piece. I did a video about the Seven Last Words, the best recordings of it, which I urge you to have a look at if you're interested in recordings specifically. But the work itself is quite extraordinary. It was a commission that came to Haydn from Spain in the mid-1780s. And the idea was to write a piece that illustrates each of the seven last words, or phrases really, that Jesus uttered on the cross before dying in the form of an adagio. So this thing consists of 7 adagios, or slower, as Haydn actually did it. There are largos and graves and things like that, in a row, followed by the earthquake and preceded by another slow movement, a slow introduction. The fascinating thing about this work is that it was written for an actual service. And at the actual service, it was commissioned from Spain, as I mentioned. And at this service, which was in some church, it's in a cave somewhere, we don't need to go into the details. What happened would be each word would be uttered, and the priest would would deliver a sermon on the word or phrase in question. And the phrases were, Mother, behold thy son, and, my Lord, why hast thou forsaken me? And I thirst, and it is finished, and into thy hands I commend my soul, O Lord. Those things. They're familiar phrases to most of us, whether you're Christian or not. And what would happen is there would be a sermon, then they would play the adagio in question, and then they would move on to the next one. And this was a church which was completely draped in black and illuminated only by candles, and at the end they would snuff out the candles. That's the story. In reality, in performance of this piece, it's nonsense, because the musicians would have had to see their music. So there would have been an orchestra lit by candles the whole time, but it was very ceremonial. And it was very claustrophobic. And remember, we're talking about the days before deodorant and toilet paper. So the stench must have been overwhelming and disgusting. And I'll bet people couldn't wait to get out of there, because it was endlessly long. I mean, Haydn's music alone is about 70 minutes. And then you've got the sermons between each thing and all the rest of the service and everything else everyone was doing. I can't imagine having to sit through such an ordeal. And Haydn's music actually is meant to be played continuously. It's an absolutely fascinating piece, because it's all this slow music, but it's not boring. It's very highly contrasted. It's extremely colorful. The orchestra is a large one, and it ends with an earthquake, because supposedly at the moment that Christ died, the heavens were rent and the earth opened up, and you know what happens. There's a convulsion of nature, according to the biblical account. But the earthquake has a serious musical function. The function of the earthquake is to awaken the audience from the contemplation of music with its deeply spiritual message, which isn't literal at all, and return us to the normal course of life and nature and the world as we know it, and all of that stuff, with great vigor and violence. It's really a stroke of genius to finish the piece with this 90-second earthquake. It's an earthquake. First of all, it's very earthquake-like. I mean, it really rocks in the classical style. I mean, it happens to be basically a sonata form. It has a regular recapitulation. Well, it's not regular. It's a modified recapitulation, but it's clearly a recapitulation. You hear the opening theme return. It is the piece that invented the triple forte. The very last chords are marked triple forte for possibly the first time in musical history that anybody cares about. So Haydn was very much his own person, and certainly not stinting on his usual innovations and desire to be original. And this became his most popular work of any of his instrumental works in his lifetime, for its spiritual qualities, of course, because it was considered to be deeply significant religiously, but also because it's just one hell of a good piece of music. And as you may also know, it exists in arrangements for piano, for string quartet. He turned it into an oratorio. There's a vocal version, but the original is a purely orchestral work. And that, I think, is how it sounds best. And that is how we're going to hear the earthquake, because the earthquake is so much better when you don't have a bunch of people going, "Oh vey, the earth, it's quaking, we're quaking, it's quaking, we're quaking and quaking because it's all quaking." You don't need that. You don't need it at all. It's much better to put the image in your mind of what's going on for this extremely exciting and forceful conclusion to an amazing, absolutely amazing piece of music. There's nothing like it in the entire 18th century, or in Haydn's output, or anyone else's. Not Mozart's, not Beethoven's, not nobody. It's a completely individual and original piece, sui generis, as they say in the biz. And I do hope you will listen to the whole thing. But for this Good Friday, for us impatient people, we can get our entire Good Friday experience in 90 seconds. So here it is. This performance is with the Tapiola Sinfonietta, conducted by John Storgard. It's an excellent performance on modern instruments on the Ondine label, The Earthquake. hot stuff, isn't it? Really, religion ought not to be so much fun. It really shouldn't. But with Haydn, it was. Haydn was one of those guys who thought that religion was fun. He always said that thinking of God made him cheerful, and it got his spirits up. And even when he's dealing with the subject of great tragedy, he was always mindful of the fact that for him, the idea of redemption and the promise of life in the after and the kingdom of heaven and all the good stuff is what Haydn was interested in. And I am convinced that it was that which motivated him not to dwell on the suffering and misery aspect of the piece, but rather on the idea of salvation, of joy, of God's beneficence. And this fantastic earthquake, believe it or not, even though it's a natural disaster, is evidence of that. It's evidence of that in its vigor, in its muscularity, in its excitement. So, happy Easter. Happy Good Friday to all of you. That is our miniature masterpiece for the holiday season. And it's as far as I'm going with holiday music. Keep on listening, folks. Take care.